It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person was torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day listeners, and welcome to the Two Jacks all around the world, and then coming all the way back to Australia. And joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack, all the way in Hong Kong. What's going on in Hong Kong at the moment today, mate?
Bleak and grey, but apart from that, it's fine.
No dramas. That sounds good. There's plenty of drama around the world, and we'll get to that.
We do have good figures. The numbers of visitors, people coming back across the border from the mainland, are starting to ramp up again. Still very low, but you know.
What are the COVID numbers like? They just don't bother.
Well, I don't think anyone knows.
Fair enough. All right. New South Wales election on Saturday, Jack. And look, I hasten to stick my chest out and say, by gee, I got it right on Friday, because we have got what looks like a minority government, probably around 45, 46 seats. A little bit different to what was being claimed on Saturday night, and indeed on Media Watch last night, landslides and what have you.
I haven't watched Media Watch, but I had my eye on Twitter over the weekend. There was a lot of people saying how terrible the journalism was, that they hadn't got it right again from the federal election. And I thought, well, that's a bit premature yet to be saying that.
Yeah, look, it was pretty obvious, even on the night of the count, and certainly the next day, that there were a number of seats where the Libs were coming back. And again, not to stick my chest out too much, Jack, I did predict that Goulburn would stay with the Liberal Party, and Labor was ahead on the Saturday night, so they were awarding that seat to Labor, and it hasn't panned out that way. Labor has picked up Penrith. There's a seat, I'm just trying to think of the name of it, in Baulkham Hills Way, where the Libs have fought back to. And the Libs always do, as we know, go pretty well on postals.
Yeah.
So it looks to me 45, 46, that sort of order. It won't bother Labor too much. They've already received guarantees of confidence and financial bills going through, supply bills going through from key independents and the Greens. So they will form government.
In any event, the way it works is that Dominic Perrottet would have been prepared to advise the governor that tell her that he couldn't form government and that she should call on Chris Minns, even if there was no guarantee from the Greens. You know. So.
Well, yes, that's right. But that was the other thing that struck me about it. This was for a New South Wales political contest, it was a very gentlemanly affair between the two leaders. And Chris Minns was reported yesterday as saying that he will consult widely with Perrottet, with the Perrottet government, and particularly Dominic himself as a former premier. And he said, Minns said basically it'd be a mug not to do that, that Dominic understood the levers of government as well as anybody. A very gentlemanly affair at that sort of leadership level. There'd been a lot of criticism about Labor's approach, but when we looked at the band of seats and the swing they needed to form a majority government, and bunched up in that 9 seats that they needed to win, were a couple of Nat seats that probably weren't going to go. And so they needed around a sort of 6% swing. Well, if you count the 2 Nats out, it was getting into the sort of 8% before they could form majority government. So it looked very, very likely to me that there would be a minority government. I thought Labor might win as few as 4, but it looks like they'll win somewhere around 8. And it could have been as few as 4, so I don't resile from any of that. But yeah, I'm very pleased that I got it right, Jack.
Well, we had the advantage. We both spoke to a couple of the hardheads in the Labor Party who can actually count. You know,
yeah, good blokes who are realistic counters too. You know, and make up their own mathematics.
Yeah.
That seemed to be the likelihood. I know there was the news poll in the end showed the news poll was just about spot on. which is very pleasing for the people running that, because polling's been a little bit been a little bit all over the place in recent times. The Media Watch Anglejack was the media had basically called this as too close to call, and that's kind of the way the media is going to be anyway, because if they're going to say, well, this is all over, no one's going to watch their news. So that was that. So Chris Minns has done the job. I think he'll be a very popular leader in New South Wales for some time. He's got that nice guy approach about him, and he will be involving the coalition, including Don Perrottet in his first few steps as Premier.
So how did the Teals go?
Well, actually, I should have had a look today. Pittwater and Wakehurst seem to be on. I haven't had a look at the figures today in the latest count. There
was nothing new so far this morning. Is Wallandilly one of theirs, or is that somebody else?
No, well, that's sort of, but not. Wallandilly is actually where I cast a vote, and I met the eventual winner. I met the Labor candidate too, and I put my vote in on a Friday night. She's a former Liberal, and she wanted to be a candidate, but she kept getting factional, getting the factional elbow out of the way. So yeah, I wouldn't call her a Teal, although it's been claimed a bit that way. Wakehurst and I would say Wakehurst is I don't want to get them confused, but those two on the North Shore are possibles for the Teals.
Yeah, Wakehurst includes a fair bit of Tony Abbott's old seat.
Yeah,
so Forest Hill, where my wife's family are from, Forest Hill, Killarney Heights, Forestville, all the way down to Brookvale. So that's not surprising that it's a sort of a Teal territory, really.
Yeah, and I got the same view of Pittwater.
Yeah,
so those two are
but no great Peel sweep this time.
Not really, no. But the swings that were required, I mean, I know you can get massive swings with Indies coming in, but the swings that were required in places like North Shore and Manly were just, for me, too much. And certainly the bookies had it that way too, with Lib's fairly firm favourite. Now, when it comes to the minors, besides the Teals, the Greens, the vote held, but it didn't grow.
No, 0.1% growth, I think. That's not much.
Yeah, no, it's basically as you were. And also we saw Labor really take them on in Balmain. And lost, didn't win the seat, didn't gain it, but that is there for the taking next time. The other Green seat was I was a bit surprised by that. I was a bit surprised by the Balmain result. I thought it'd be a lot more, big sort of swing towards the Greens, or at least they'd stay as they were. So they just did okay. One Nation's gone backwards. Certainly in the upper house vote, they're down by a point. Elizabeth Farrelly, I don't know what we quite say about Elizabeth Farrelly independence, other than they chalked up 1.3% in the upper house, where they didn't have anything before. So that's 1.3% swing towards them, of course.
That would be the literary vote.
Yeah. So look, what we can see is that as the vote switched from Liberal to Labor, that's basically what happened. And that sort of none of the above independent or small party vote didn't really materialise to the left or to the right. It looks like there'll be a legalised cannabis kitty in the upper house, still yet to be worked out. The way the numbers are at the moment, I'll just have a quick look.
Could this person be the first person to chuff down on a joint in the precincts of Parliament House, do you think?
Well, there's two in Victoria now, and there's two in the upper house in Victoria now, and I'd say almost certainly there will be one in the New South Wales upper house. So there were 21 up for grabs in the 42-seat chamber. Labor's won 8 of that 21. Coalition 6, possibly 7. Greens 2. That's going to remain fairly firm. One Nation, only the 1. Legalised cannabis 1. Lib Dems, a chance of 1. The Shooters, a chance of 1. The Animal Justice Party, a chance of 1. And when I talk about that, it's likely that some of that will go to the coalition. So one of those Lib Dem Shooters or the AJP may cede an upper house seat to the coalition as the postals come through. What does it all mean, Jack?
It looks to me like the way we saw it earlier on, that the Liberal Party had been in government for 12 years, and it was sort of time for it. And they weren't 16, a bad government.
16 was too far, yeah.
They weren't a bad government, but they were a bit accident-prone. There had been a few too many scandals, and time was up.
Well, that's what happens when governments have been in for a while, isn't it? Particularly when they've had leadership changes and so forth. You tend to have your interchange bench playing at centre half forward. In senior ministries, and one of the big wins, and an old Labor favourite candidate picked up Monero. There's a seat once held by John Barilaro, and I guess that comes as no surprise.
Yeah.
Because every time John Barilaro got a mention during the campaign was a bad day for the coalition. Now, Barry Cassidy piped up a bit on Twitter on Saturday night, Jack. He said, now that the coalition doesn't govern anywhere on the mainland, time to accept, I guess we go sick, it's time to accept that people care about climate change and they will never flirt with right-wing religious zealots and their awful discriminatory prejudices.
I was rather amused at that because the new Premier is a Catholic from Cogaramaris Brothers and is probably more in favour of continuing coal mining,
religious zealots,
continuing coal mining, etc., than the outgoing Premier.
No, they didn't pick up the upper hunt. Look, the other tweet from Barry that I did pick up, that is actually worth discussing. If you want to better understand what the red map of Australia means in reality, have a look at these figures. In lower houses around the country, including federally, Labor now has, based on New South Wales projections, we could take a couple off now, but he quoted the figure of 346 seats to the coalition's 198. And that is a significant gap. Obviously, it doesn't mean much in
and you have to remember
the overall scheme of things.
The last time things looked this bleak for the Liberals was 2007, and within 4 years they were back in power in New South Wales and stayed there for 12 years, and within 6 years they were back in power federally and stayed there for 10 years.
Well, might I be so bold as to suggest that's because Labor pulled out the company pistol and shot themselves in the head. Yeah,
there's a bit of that, both in New South Wales and in federally. That's true. There's a bit of that, but you shouldn't sort of, just because you're in front today doesn't mean you're going to be in front in 3 years' time.
Yeah, look, the other big thing for us is the Aston by-election. It's a big test for the Liberal Party. They hold it by, I think, 3 or 4%. Went down to the wire. Might be a little bit less than that. I'm hearing they might be in trouble, Jack.
I wouldn't be surprised if they were. I'd be surprised if they held on to it.
And that would be the first time a sitting government has won a seat in a by-election federally since 1920.
Yeah.
So that would send trembles through the Liberal Party if they lost that one. It would leave them basically with 2 metropolitan seats in Melbourne, if we're not going to count Casey and Latrobe, which is sort of the outer suburbs, if you like. And not a good result at all. Would it kick off a spill? I have a feeling it might.
Oh, I don't think it will.
No? Well, I guess the problem.
Firstly, I expect
problem with that assumption is who's going to take over.
Yeah. Firstly, I think they probably will lose the seat.
Really?
And I would note that I know it's a long time since a government's won a by-election federally.
Well, 103 years, Jack.
But they don't generally happen quite so quick during the honeymoon period.
Well, they do a bit because there'll be after after Min's win on Saturday night, you can imagine there'll be a number of by-elections in Liberal held seats going forward. There'll be a number of retirements. I'm not so confident that the Libs will lose. I think they might hang on. I have seen
if they hang on, it'll be by their fingernails.
Yeah, it'll be close. It's definitely going to be close. But the Liberal candidate there is sort of highly qualified to be a Liberal candidate, a wife of a colleague of mine, albeit at the Herald Sun, Ms. Campbell. She's got
he's the bloke who looks like that Pixar character when he goes on the Insiders on Sunday morning, Mr. Potato Head.
He's good. I like his political analysis, to be honest. I think he plays pretty close down the line. But I've noticed her electoral bump, Jack. Now, you'd expect it to be blue, wouldn't you? You'd expect it to be the royal blue of the Liberal Party, but no, it's got a pinkish hue, isn't it?
No,
that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I've handed out a lot of that sort of stuff, and I can tell you, this is not the first time a little bit of skullduggery's gone on in that regard.
Yeah, there's not too many mentions of the Liberal Party and the old bump going around Aston at the moment. We'll see what happens, and we'll give you a full summary of that. Hopefully we'll know a result. We probably should by the time we record next week.
Just while I think of it, I can remember there was a time when the Labor Party material had a lot of Australian flags and not much mention of Labor on it. So,
yeah. That's the way it goes. But they've gone from blue to pink, Jack.
Yeah.
Which is it reflects something. It reflects there's not a lot of confidence in the Liberal Party in Victoria, which brings us to the very next point that Moira Deemy has been not expelled. She has been suspended from the party, which seems like it's a calamity for both sides, really.
It probably is. I didn't think she'd be expelled. So
you did say that, yeah. The tip I was getting was from my mate and colleague at the Australian, John Ferguson, saying that the Liberal leader had the numbers, but it would seem that it's been fought out to a 0-0 draw. So she's been suspended from the party room for, I think, 9 months.
Yeah.
And she did, and I don't want to make any light of this at all, but she did, I think, announce that she had been indecently dealt with, raped, in fact, when she was 4 years of age, and certainly not making light of that, and that she'd been the victim of sexual abuse throughout much of her childhood. So that was why she opened up on that, and that was why what she said to the party room. It doesn't leave the Victorian Liberal leader in a very good spot for mine. And it seems like they negotiated a settlement that was wouldn't so no one would lose face, but in the end, everyone sort of has.
It's the reporting of it certainly suggests that. As I understand it, she made a speech, and he adjourned the meeting straight after the speech, having a quick look around the room to see where he thought the numbers were, and they went out into the corridor, and sorted out a deal. I think he overreached in the first place. Was his problem?
He probably did. I mean, look, the art of politics is always understanding what your numbers are, and
you've got to be able to count. You know,
I think he probably did. There's no point taking action if you can't get it across the line. And a little bit like if we go back to Anthony Albanese in opposition when he took on the CFMEU, the Victorian branch of the CFMEU, and expelled John Setka or tried to expel John Setka and ultimately got it through. But it was like, mate, don't pick a fight you can't win, you know? And that's sort of the art of politics. And so the Victorian Liberals are sort of as you were. We'll see how Aston goes, and that will be a further reflection on the Liberal Party, both federally and at the state level. Meanwhile, Jack, we have...
What I think Pasuto got wrong was he certainly should have given... what's her name? Moira Deeming a fair old bollocking for
that was definitely needed.
Not jumping all over the Nazis, but
hanging around while the Nazis were saluting.
But he ran into a problem because the trans rights activists, speaking of people taking on a fight they can't win, they're losing all around the world because they've taken on lesbians and feminists. And here's some free advice for you, TRAs. Don't do that because you won't win. Don't make them angry.
Well,
don't make the lesbians and feminists angry because they will win.
Polly Parker turned up in Auckland. She had about 7 people there, as far as I could tell.
Yeah,
and there was a great clamour of people, not pro-trans necessarily, but a lot of them were. And that was the end of the tour, shall we say. Yeah. The Wellington leg was quickly cancelled, and that was
5 years ago. 5 years ago, with the urging of the trans rights activists, they were opening clinics all around the Western world to provide what they call gender-affirming care to teenagers, etc. And yes, they're closing in Republican states in the United States, but they've also closed in Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark and England. That debate's going, you wouldn't know it if you lived in Victoria, but that debate is going against the trans activists all around the world.
Well, they're also banning books in the south there, Jack. In the United States, they're going through books. They're banning books, so there's no accounting for the right.
They're banning books. Right. They're burning books in New Zealand. They were burning J.K. Rowling's books yesterday.
Were they?
Yes, indeed.
That's a bit rough. Yeah, that's a bit rough. Look, basically on this particular issue, I've sort of steered away from it. It's way too controversial for me. And
I don't want to go into it. I'm just making a political observation that in Victoria they think that the trans activists are winning the political debate. And my observation is that they're not around the world.
Well, the protests at Auckland would tell you otherwise. But that was because Parker was essentially.
I don't think she's got much to do with the wider political situation.
I would certainly argue that she's not representative of women's rights. You know, I mean, and Moira Deeming, just by the way, is a person who's anti-abortion. So, you know, how does that fit with women's rights?
Yeah, but the people who are going to win this debate are people like J.K. Rowling and Martina Navratilova. It's not going to be Sharon Davies, the former UK Olympian. They're the people who are going to win the debate, nothing to do with Posey Parker.
Now, we'll see about all of that, Jack. Meanwhile, another issue that is confounding the nation, that is the voice. And now we have a proposal. And now you suggested there were, I think, 3 options, or was it 4 available to the Albanese government? And they've gone for what you would say was the hardest, the crash through or crash.
The high risk approach, yeah.
And that is basically, well, we would love to see the Solicitor General's advice, wouldn't we, in terms of where the advice to the executive might become subject to legal challenge.
Yes.
That particular constitutional grey area.
Yeah. And I saw Brett Walker was on the radio this morning in Australia talking about this and saying he doesn't think much of a problem. And
Brett Walker, he's been very, very clear about it up front.
He goes to the High Court more than anybody, I think. But
he does. He's got the most number of games under the belt. Yep.
Yeah. But I don't think he's right on this occasion, and for this reason, I think we've got to look beyond today to what the High Court will do with this referendum if it gets up in 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years' time. This is the biggest change to Australia's constitution ever, because the voice is not just putting in an extra section about the ages judges can finish, or how often we have to go to an election. The voice gets its own chapter in Parliament, And that means that the High Court, I think, in 5 or 6 years' time, will treat the voice as sort of the equivalent of the other bodies that get their own chapter in Parliament. That is the Parliament and the Executive. So the three of those will be treated pretty much like equals. And
that's highly contended at the moment, as you say.
And that's because the government says that the court will look at all the guff around the voice, the documents that go out with it, and the court will do that with legislation. They will look at the second reading speech, all that sort of stuff. What did the Parliament actually mean when they did this? But with the voice, it's not the Parliament doing this, it's the people. And the court won't be able to say, this is what the people meant. The court will look at the actual document. And this will give us a new constitution, in my view. That's my reading of it. This will give us a whole new document. And they will look at it and treat it like that.
All right. I'm prepared to look more at the politics of it and the punditry of it. How do you regard the chance of this getting up? I mean, we don't know what the coalition. Get up, yeah. Seriously, can you make your minds up, please? I mean, we want more information, so they get more information, and then they go, well, we want more information, and so they get more information. They're sort of paralysed by fear, aren't they? Not the coalition, the Liberal Party, the Federal Liberal Party. They're absolutely paralysed with fear at the moment as to, they get something wrong. I'll make a bit of punditry here. If Albo gets this up, if the referendum gets a big tick, I mean, I reckon he'll rule for at least 2 or 3 terms. As long as he wants, basically. But
that's possible, Bill, but I don't think they'll get it up, to be honest. And I don't think the Liberal Party position is relevant in that. I just don't think the people will accept.
Well, they've got to make up their minds, don't they, Jack? They've got to have a position outside of. Can we have more information, please?
I don't think they have to make up their minds. They can have an open vote on this, and it would still make no difference to the outcome. The outcome's not going to be decided on party political lines. I think this will probably lose now because the government's taken the high-risk approach. I would like to see constitutional recognition, and you could get constitutional recognition up pretty easily in a referendum if you restricted it to that. But I think they've overreached. And I think I suspect that they won't get a majority of people in the majority of states to agree with this fundamental change to the Constitution.
Just make a note here, Jack. 28th of the 3rd, you predicted the referendum would not succeed. So we'll get back to you.
Sorry, I might add.
Hang on. We've got a caveat, have we?
My caveat is if it goes ahead in its current state.
It still has to go to the Parliament, of course.
Yes.
And it may be subject
that's
to
where it should have gone a long time ago. This should have been, the actual proposal should have been debated in Parliament.
What do you mean a long time ago? The government was only elected 9 months ago. Well, getting on for 12 now.
But what they shouldn't have gone to Parliament with what they say is a set-in-stone proposal. They should have gone, but we want to do this. Let's have a committee to look at it. Let's everyone have their say and see what we come up with.
Yeah, and a year is a reasonable amount of time to do that, I would have thought.
No, it's going to go up in June. They're going to vote on it in. They're going to
No. I'm talking about since they formed government.
Yeah.
To bring it to the Parliament within a year, I think is a reasonable time frame.
But they want this legislation through by June, I think, with a vote in October. That's not enough time in the Parliament for a proper debate about what the actual content of the proposal is.
Well, currently, mate, the coalition just votes no on everything.
Yeah,
so it's the only thing that they're basically have thrown the books open to a possible yes or maybe. They've just voted no on everything so far, and almost excluded themselves from the political conversation, particularly when we get to net zeros and carbon emissions reductions. But that's another matter. We'll get on to that in a little while. We've got a bit of an issue, Jack.
I just think that this new proposal, the proposal as it is, takes us a long way down the road to the New Zealand model of co-governance, and I don't think the Australian people will buy that.
We'll see. 28th to the 3rd, 1:21 p.m. Your opinion has been noted. Asylum seeker
I'm
backlog.
happy to be wrong.
We have, all right. Yes, look, it's no good in a punditry game if you're prepared. I've always told you, no matter whether you're right or wrong, you've got to be certain.
Yeah, well, I'm fairly certain. But, yeah.
Look, the asylum seeker backlog, we do have a real problem here. And there's a piece in the John Menadue blog written by reporter Abul Rizvi.
He's a former senior immigration department official.
Right.
Very senior.
And
one of the best.
We've got an asylum seeker backlog at 100,000, getting near 100,000 now. And this is not about boat arrivals, Jack. This is a bulk of those 100,000 cases are those who arrived before the pandemic, a period of sort of labour trafficking of Malaysian and Chinese nationals.
Yep.
Around the middle of the previous decade. Until the start of the pandemic. Now, this is basically on Peter Dutton's watch, so the Libs aren't doing anything about it. Labor are not all that keen to do much about it either, so it looks like we've just got this hideous situation. As Rizvi went on to report, it's an excellent report. I'll actually put this up on the Facebook page. It's okay at the moment because we've got basically full employment. But when those circumstances change, or when and if, those people who are, essentially not allowed to work, are they? If they've been rejected as asylum seekers, they can't work, and they'll be sort of forced into a sort of form of wage slavery.
Yeah, that's fixable. They can be given bridging visas, etc., to allow them to work. The real problem is, how do you deal with the backlog?
I noticed that they've been doing. I noticed that the immigration department's been very, very good at turning over work visas. What do you call them? 451s, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. That sort of visa. They've been turning them over in a couple of weeks. So they've obviously thrown some resources into immigration, and perhaps they need to throw a few more in.
No, this needs an entirely fresh approach to deal with a backlog of this kind.
Okay.
Almost none of these 100,000 cases will succeed. Not almost none. Very few of them will succeed. But they just need to be dealt with fairly transparently and expeditiously. Right.
Now, the big story around the world, Jack, we are leaving these shores and we're moving to the Middle East now, Israel. Really some just basically scenes that we've never really seen in Israel before in terms of protest, nationwide strikes, etc.
It looks more like France, doesn't it?
We'll get to them because they love a stink. And you can only just make little minor tinker into legislation and they'll hit the streets. Yeah. But Israel, this is unforeseen in Israel's history.
Well, I wouldn't say it's unforeseen.
They're big numbers on the streets, mate. Yeah, and nationwide strikes, that's never happened before. So that's unprecedented. But
they are an amazingly disputatious group of people. There's a lovely old story that a Jewish friend tells of the Jewish bloke who's set down on a remote island and does well in business, and he builds 2 synagogues. And he's interviewed afterward, why did you build 2 synagogues? He said, well, I built one, that's the one I go to, and the other one I built because that's the one I wouldn't set foot in no matter how much money you paid me.
Yeah, look,
they like disagreement.
Netanyahu has stepped back overnight, and an uneasy calm, according to the BBC reports this morning, an uneasy calm has fallen over Israel. Because he's announced he would delay a key part of the controversial plans to overhaul the justice system. What are those plans, Jack? Do you want me to just briefly go through them?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, look, the government which is Israel's most right wing ever, is seeking to take decisive control over the committee which appoints judges. The reforms would give the parliament authority to override the Supreme Court's decisions with a basic majority and would make it difficult to declare a prime minister unfit for office. Oh, hello, Benjamin, and remove them from power.
There could be a bit of self-interest in that. One of the things that's causing big controversy in Israel is at the moment, effectively, the judges appoint their own successors, which I think Israel's the only place in the world where this happens. And what the current government wants to do is to return the power to appoint judges back to the government and the parliament.
It's not just appointing judges, though. It's more like they can override Supreme Court judges. Yeah. So it would be like
the sticking point seems to be the appointment at the moment in terms of the process.
Yeah, that's true. But it would also say it would be like our High Court coming down with a judgment and the Australian government, whoever's in power, would say, well, no, we're not doing that. And we're going to override it. So that's why people are on the streets. There's been nationwide strikes. Main airports, shops and banks closed, even hospital services were stopped. And it would seem that they were at the brink, and then Mr. Netanyahu has blinked.
More importantly, retired and serving people in the military, etc., and the security services are opposed to the changes. And that's something that Netanyahu is going to have to deal with.
That's not good for Benjamin. No, not good at all. Yes, that's unfolding, and we'll keep people appraised of that.
I watched Netanyahu do an interview with Piers Morgan, and Piers has gone off, and most of his stuff appears on YouTube, not anywhere else that anyone's going to see it, but a lot of people are watching it on YouTube. And the measure of that is, in the last week, Ron DeSantis has sat down for an interview with him, and this week Benjamin Netanyahu did. So maybe the future's in doing interviews on YouTube, not on the television.
Well, that takes us to the United States, and I did notice during that interview, Jack, that Ron DeSantis, who had he'd sort of taken a step down the sort of Trumpian path of that have been reflected in the sort of hard right of the Republican Party now, not to continue to support Ukraine, and that featured the arrival of a Wall Street Journal editorial saying, no, champion, and this is not sensible for you. And I did notice during that interview with Piers that he said yes, that Mr. Putin should face a court over war crimes. So
he walked it back a fair way, didn't he? Really,
he'd read the editorial. Clearly, he had read the editorial. So yes, his main opponent, Jack, has predicted. We talked about this last week. He was the only one who said he was going to get arrested. I'm going to get arrested on Tuesday. None of it happened, and he was the only one saying it. I'll be arrested on Tuesday, and then the media went nuts trying to talk about what steps would need to be taken, what negotiations had taken place between the Secret Service and the NYPD and all this sort of stuff. But it was only Trump who'd been saying it. So the week has gone by and he remains unarrested. But that didn't stop him at Waco, Texas, Jack, a very symbolic place of a lot of bloody conflict, where he predicted death and destruction. Not sure for who, but death and destruction if he was arrested.
Interesting thing about the Waco, Texas rally, and Trump is excellent at these rallies. He is, after all, a carnival huckster. Really, at heart. You know?
I watched part of the speech. God, you couldn't sit through it all. He goes for a couple of hours. But I watched part of the speech and I really see a big change in him. I know we talk about Biden losing mental capacity and what have you. I see that a little bit in Trump at the moment too.
Yeah. The most interesting part of the Waco thing was the crowd loved him and the crowd cheer along with him, except when he started to sledge Ron DeSantis and the crowd went silent and stayed silent until he stopped.
I did not know that. Did they, really?
Yes, they did.
Was that because we don't know who he is or we quite like him?
Oh, no.
Okay. Well, of course.
And I saw some polls this morning which would back this up. These are from one of the Republican pollsters. DeSantis leads Trump 45-37 in a head-to-head in Iowa, and 39-39 in New Hampshire, and they're the first two states who vote in the primaries.
Yeah, that's primaries, yeah.
And DeSantis wins all of the down the ballot type of things, best temperament.
Midwest, what are we talking about? I mean, look, I know it's early days for the primary. The Iowa is not a primary, by the way. It is a caucus. I hate to be technical there, but where on that polling does DeSantis stand in states like Michigan, Wisconsin,
Minnesota? They haven't polled them. They polled the first two. But that's
heartland stuff. That's where elections are won and lost in the United States.
If the outsider can win those first two votes, they're well placed.
And, of course, there were some fake pics, Jack, bit of Photoshop work going on with the Donald being arrested. And I think they were done. My understanding of the source of this stuff was it's kind of this sort of mockery from the left. But then they were published on Breitbart, acknowledging that they were fake. And then they sort of got scooped up and went all around social media. And on the back of that, the Trump campaign raised about $2 million.
Yeah, I sort of wondered at the provenance of those.
They did look, Trump was looking very worried and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. Look, can I mention this, Jack? There's if you're arrested in New York, you're fingerprinted. There's much has been made of that whether he be handcuffed or fingerprinted, but he'll also be cheek swabbed, Jack. And you know that there's a civil case involving allegations of rape, buddy. So, you wouldn't mind getting hands on the DNA in that court case, would you? One way or the other.
I'll see where that plays out.
But that is part of the process in New York, a bit of a cheek swab. Anyone arrested there. And we mentioned the French before. They love a stink, Jack. They hit the streets at the drop of a hat.
They do.
And I did post a wonderful photograph on my Twitter account with some diners dining al fresco, while some sort of arson was going on in the background. A bit of a pile of debris had been set fire to. It just reminded that the French get out in the streets whenever they feel angry about something, and they're angry about this. You know what it's about, Jack?
Yeah, it's raising the retirement age by a couple of years.
And it would still be from 62 to 64.
It would still be lower than the UK, Germany, Italy, etc., etc.
The French pension is, God. Yeah. Maybe I understand why my very good friend Paul Ham lives in Paris now. He might be hankering for a French pension. So, Macron knew he couldn't get it through. The Parliament, so he made essentially an executive decree, and that was enough to get the petrol bombs filled, the Molotov cocktails filled up, and hit the streets. Off we go.
Yeah, people on social media were amazed that the French would be so relaxed about this happening in their midst. But I've got to tell you, living through the protests here in Hong Kong, most Hong Kongers were just as relaxed because we knew that a lot of this stuff is just theatre. It takes place in set places and at set times. And if the cameras who covered the protests in Hong Kong had bothered to swing and look the other way, they would have seen people going about their day-to-day business.
Well, that's what the French did rather delightfully on the weekend. They're just continuing to sip on their chocolat and have a little chat to people next to them while they were this raging inferno not far away. Very, very funny photograph. Picked up a lot on Twitter. You'll see it on my Twitter feed if you haven't seen it already. What's going on with the banks, Jack? They seem that crisis seems to have come and gone.
Yeah, well, there was big talk about Deutsche Bank over the weekend, but I've been speaking to a few friends from the business, and they say, well, look, it's not Credit Suisse. It probably deserves to be off off price-wise a bit. It's off a lot more than that. But a lot of that happens because of what they call the quants. These are the clever with numbers young chaps who see a trend and try and get ahead of the trend all the time. So.
Yes, all right. But banking around the world is safe. I've got to tell you, just as an aside, some of our friends from the Cooker movement thought this was going to be the end of capitalism as we know it, and we're extolling their people to take their cash out and actually do it as a sort of a form of political activism that they could, by sheer weight of numbers, by draining their cash,
they could bring down a bank.
They could bring down.
Yeah, well.
Sorry, I just had to throw that in there. Yeah. They were advocating, as various Cooker groups are doing that over the last week or so. You know, get in there, take your money out. And go, what are you doing?
There's never been a shortage of deluded people.
No, well, it never is. There's actually, I think we got a few more per capita than we used to. You've been talking a lot about energy, Jack, particularly in the developing world, and we have been looking long and hard at South Africa's very substantial energy problems, failure to plan, failure to build infrastructure, brownouts all over the place. What's the update there, Jack?
Well, it's spread from South Africa. It's happening in Zimbabwe and Nigeria, which are two of the more important African countries.
Well, Nigeria is, I think, one of the great oil producers in the world, isn't it? There's about three or four in the world.
Yes, but the problem's not the oil. The problem is electricity. That they just can't produce it regularly enough to keep the power on.
Well, it is, as you were saying. These are major exposés of corruption, aren't they?
Yes.
I mean, Zimbabwe, good Lord.
Corruption and bad ideas.
Yeah, and Nigeria has just had an election where they re-elected the sitting president, so no change there. When we move, what's South Africa going to do? It's virtually, well, I don't know whether collapse is the right, social collapse is the right term, but it's getting very close to a serious calamity.
It is. A great place to live, a great place to visit, I'm told, at the moment, because the cost of living is cheap if you're not a South African.
I bet. But if you are going to sit around the pool, the filtration system won't be working.
Might not be working.
Between the hours of 8 in the morning and 5 at night.
If you wander around the Cape District enjoying their wonderful wines and food, you'll be paying a derisory amount of money for it.
That's a shame.
But that's the problem. South Africa's become a one-party state, and that's always a problem.
Well, still with energy, Jack, in Europe, the EU is sort of deadlocked on whether to recognise nuclear power as an equal to renewable energy. What's the definition there? Surely, is it a carbon? Is it emissions, or how are they defining this?
I think it's an EU definition, so it's probably fairly floating. The importance of the designation as a renewable is that gives you access to a lot of funds from Brussels to build your energy plants out.
Okay, and in Australia,
so the Germans are saying no, we don't think nuclear should be part of that because they've closed their nuclear power stations down, and the French who have lots of them say absolutely this must be part of the renewables.
70% of their mix in France is nuclear, and they are reducing that to 50%. And they did find out, and we covered this, they did find out in a very dry, hot summer with rivers declining and not flowing as they normally do, and also water temperatures rising. The water required to cool couldn't be brought online, or it had to either limit production or stop production altogether.
Yeah. So they want to change their mix from adjust their mix, and that's perfectly reasonable, I think.
Meanwhile, look, it's God, you never know with the Greens, Jack. I mean, now we're back in Australia again on energy. You never know with the Greens. It seems like a deal has been struck over what's the term? What's the term they're using? The buzzword that they're using at the moment?
Net zero.
Not net zero. That's been around for a long time. This is the basically the heavy polluters will be limited. They'll have limits placed on their emissions, and they will have to carbon trade where they exceed those emissions.
And there'll be limits put on the carbon trading as well, as I understand the Greens' position.
And so there should be, because there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of rorting going on there, particularly around rural land.
It does look a lot like a scam, doesn't it?
Well, some of it is, some of it isn't. But the stuff, look, you could just buy 13 hectares, Jack. We could throw a bit of money in the pot with some of our listeners, buy 13 hectares and just let the thing grow. Just never go anywhere near it, and apply for and receive carbon credits. So, yeah, they've got to have a real good look at that. But will the Greens hold true, Jack? Whew, I don't know.
Yeah, I just don't. I don't think if you look at the world as a whole, the argument for stopping new coal and gas in Australia makes any sense at all.
Oh, well, that's certainly the view of. I saw the woman who runs the lobby group that in charge of gas, that we should actually be doing more and more exploration. It doesn't stop. The Labor policy, the government's policy, doesn't stop exploration. But it mandates that new exploration, new coal, actually be zero emitting. Not quite sure how that works with coal.
No, I'm not sure how it works either.
But we're not talking about dig it out of the ground, load it on a jumbo, and chuck it in a burner somewhere. We're talking about the mines themselves being net zero.
Yeah,
and that seems to have acquiesced the Greens to some degree.
If you create economic uncertainty around the business, people aren't going to pay for people like our pal Grant to go out and sit in the desert and drill holes.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it will diminish, the exploration side of things. It does limit.
People only spend that money if they're going to get a return.
But this was the bugbear for the Greens, and it is. I've got to tell you, this is Adam Bant, as I said in the column a few weeks ago, folding like Superman on laundry day, and he seems to do quite a lot of that, Jack.
Yeah. Well, I think they're living in they are part of the deluded in Australia. I think the Greens on this.
All right. Well, we'll see if they're able to get. They still haven't got the numbers to. That's the government. Still don't have the numbers to get it through the Senate. If they have Green support, they're very close. They'll need, I think, one or two more. Lydia Thorpe might be one of those, and our former Wallaby. Senator seems to be the government's go-to man for negotiating the passage of bills through the Senate.
Yeah, he seems to be able to corral the other crossbenchers a little bit.
I'd have to say, he's a very impressive performance when we look at some of the other examples of independent senators, and there are a pretty desultory history. We can all talk of Ralph Babbitt, from Palmer's party, who barely is listened to and routinely ignored, and our former Wallaby playing pal has done really well, just in terms of applying himself to the task. Yeah,
he's the most organised. It seems to me since Brian Harrader.
This is another good one from the past there, Jack. Yeah, he certainly does. Now we're going to have a long...
Nick Xenophon wasn't too bad.
Nick was good. Yeah. My favourite Nick story, I got to know Nick Xenophon quite well, and my favourite Nick story was they were going to have a Senate inquiry into Scientology, and I'm not a fan of Scientology. It's a terrible cult. And destroys a lot of lives. So I was particularly pleased to see that. Nick said he was he had support of the Liberals and Labor to get it through. And he walked into the Senate the following day, and then it both disappeared. They're just gone. Because the major parties won't go anywhere near sort of religious freedom stuff, even if it's Scientology. So he walked in there. Oh, hang on, where is everybody? And they had left him in the lurch there. Now, we're going to have a bit of an extended chat here now, Jack, about lockdowns and social consequences. It's your best. The United Kingdom, they've got a lot of truancy. Jack, you must have skipped school a bit when you were a kid, didn't you?
I didn't have much choice. I was at boarding school for a bit of it, so although I did
just skip off and run down the main street of Kilburn.
No, it's possible. It's possible. Three of us ended up in Bendigo for a weekend, having gone out on a 2-hour leave. I didn't get back for a day or so, and I think I got suspended for that.
Ah, well, there you go. So is this sort of thing occurring now in the UK?
Yeah,
post-COVID?
It backs up an anecdotal story I heard at the end of the lockdowns, was that they weren't getting back a kind of a generation of the troubled kids who they were struggling to keep in school. None of them came back.
Yeah, hearing anecdotal reports about similar sort of circumstances in Australia.
And the figures from the UK would back that up, that their level of absenteeism of kids from school is always an element of
what
it,
they call severely absent, which presumably is just not attending at all. And there are 60,000 of them in the UK defined as severely absent.
That's a rise of 134%.
Double the money and a little bit more.
A little bit more, yep.
Absence is now a feature of school life. Just under 2 million pupils. This is the UK. 1 in 4 of all school children are classified as persistently absent, i.e. have an attendance rate of less than 90%. So this is a consequence of lockdowns, Jack?
I think it probably is, yeah.
Yeah, all right. Well, we're going to have a detailed chat about this. There was a piece in The Australian written by Adam Crichton where he basically claimed that Sweden had more or less won the pandemic, if I could be so so offensive. It really wasn't arguing that. The point he was making was Sweden did not have lockdowns. Now, they did have social distancing measures and mask wearing and those sorts of things. But the point he was making was that by the current measure that we're using, that is excess mortality, that Sweden's excess mortality was lower than the rest of the world. Now, I'll move on to why that's a bit contentious in a little while. And he cited an OECD report. Did you take a look at that, Jack, today?
I did. I'd seen it before, actually.
Okay. It, in fact, actually had been around since November, but this seems to have just kindled up a bit of the anti-lockdown stuff just recently. So it's been around for a while.
The most notable thing about the OECD report, if you compare Sweden and Australia, is Australia had a lot more Sweden had a lot more COVID deaths than Australia.
Yeah, huge number.
But their excess deaths numbers are about the same.
Well, they're about the same in that, yeah. So the OECD report dealt only with excess deaths in the 2020 and 2021 period, and I think Sweden's were at 4% and Australia's at 3%. Was at 3% in that period, and that's compared to 2015 to 2019. So that's the baseline, and then you have this 2020 to 2021, and then Adam went on to, and a number of other op-eds have done this too, looked at this sort of our world in data to look at excess deaths since. The first thing well, not the first thing, but just to give an idea for our listeners, what we talk cumulative COVID deaths as of March 21, 2023. Sweden has 23,813, Australia 19,447. Expressed as death rate per million, Sweden is 2,257, Australia 743 per million. So in that COVID death measure, Australia's done a good deal better. Lots of reasons for that too that don't actually relate to lockdowns or those sorts of policy things. And I'll get to that in a minute. I've really had a good hard look at a lot of this stuff. The excess death rate now in Australia, just in the last measurable period, which is November to January, end of January 2023, ABS statistics, Australia has an excess death rate of 15.1%. And I'll break those down a little while. Depending on which epidemiologist you listen to, Sweden has an excess death rate running around between 4 and 5%. Now, some people claim that's the lowest, but it's not. There's the Danish figure. The Danish figure is 2.5. And again, it depends what you measure. If you're measuring 2017 to 2019, you'll get a different figure on Sweden. But if you measure 2015 to 2019, you'll get Sweden coming in third. That's pretty good, right? That's still very good, and a long way short of Australia's figures. But Denmark is the winner with 2.5 excess mortality in that 2015 to 2019 period. Denmark, of course, had lockdowns, and so what also caught my eye is the OECD did in their study across all of the 38 OECD nations, and there was a share of population suffering from depression or showing symptoms of depression. Pre-COVID, Sweden stood at 11%, and in 2021 it was 30%. That's a very high figure. Australia's was 10% pre-COVID and 28% high again, but just a little bit lower than Sweden. So you would imagine, without lockdowns, Jack, it'd be dancing in the streets. But of course, there are other factors, aren't there? There's the whole anxiety. There's the economics. Go on, sorry.
And that figure includes people who felt sad.
It's difficult to measure. We're not talking about clinical diagnosis,
No. So it included people who had some sadness.
Well, this is my point about this comparison, and this sort of nation by nation comparison, right? That it's very sort of subjective anyway, and we can use lies and damn statistics all we like. But also there are external factors, or there are factors other than the pandemic. But the thing that really strikes me about a lot of this argument is that some of us expected a pandemic to have no human cost. That if you did one thing or another, everything would be beautiful and nothing bad would ever happen. And I just think that's absolute nonsense. Economically, Jack, if we're going to compare Sweden to Australia, Sweden's recession was deeper and longer than ours, went for 3 quarters. They had good economic growth in 2022, 5%. And GDP per capita, Australia just a little bit better there too. So if we're going to measure these things, we've got to look at the economics of it as well. The other thing that we need to talk about whenever we do this like for like sort of thing, it's not just apples and oranges in that particular piece that Adam Crichton made. It's comparing apples to narwhals. They're just completely different things. Who's got an older population, Sweden or Australia? Give me a guess.
I think Sweden has, actually.
Yeah, Sweden's got 20% of people aged 65 or more.
Yeah.
Australia 16%, Denmark 16%. So Sweden's got a very, very an older population, and that may well have impacted. I'm not an epidemiologist, so I'm not going to say, but it may well have impacted on their higher rate of COVID deaths, and may well have. There may be other impacts going down the line. And of course, who has a better health system? By any measure or any reputable measure, Sweden's is a little bit better than ours. Denmark is
slightly. Yeah, but not much difference.
well, the way it ranks, and I looked at the rankings from the reputable agencies. Denmark won. Sometimes South Korea won, but we'll put South Korea in second place on average. Sweden around 4 and Australia around 10. So those things have an impact as well. And you can tell I've got a column coming, don't you, about all of this? Keeping out of Crichton quite a belting.
Yeah, I hope you don't put too many stats in it. No one's going to read it.
Yeah, well, this is, you need data. So we've got in our Senate right now a senator from the LNP talking about excess deaths being vaccine related, or why didn't these vaccines protect us from having excess deaths? And we do have this excess death rate at 15.1%. That's ABS official figures. Now, I can tell you that the fastest growing cause of death in Australia is diabetes. On those figures, 19%. 19%. Now, is the vaccine supposed to stop us from sitting on the couch and eating Tim Tams? Maybe that was a lockdown thing. I don't know. But it's certainly
maybe it was closing all the parks and beaches.
Well, like I say, I mean, and I've spoken about this on the Conditional Release Program. I was no fan of lockdowns. I would understand in 2020 pre-vaccines how that might have been a significant policy response, but there was stuff in there that was absolute garbage, locking down swings and slides and all that, and curfews in Victoria. We've talked about this, just nuts. It was just like the Andrews government saying, what's the best way to control the population? To the police. And the police said, well, curfews. I said, okay, well, let's have one of them.
Yeah.
So not a fan of lockdowns, but I'd rather people sort of look at these things in the right way. When we look at Sweden's low figures, it depends on who you listen to and which epidemiologist you listen to. Because there is one Swedish epidemiologist. Her name is Karin Modig. She's an epidemiologist at Sweden's Karolinska Institute. She said, as soon as you compare between countries, it's more difficult because countries have different trends of mortality. They have different age structures, and in the pandemic, they might have had different seasonal variations. She described the 2017 to 2019 analysis, which gave Sweden the gold medal, as quite crude. She went on to say, mortality doesn't tell the whole story about what effect the pandemic has had on different countries. The excess mortality measure has its weaknesses and depends a lot on the demographic structures of countries. But anyway, she says, when it comes to that measure, it looks like Sweden managed to do quite well. I would say we also did pretty well, but we made a lot of mistakes. And we need to examine those in the full and open forum of a judicial inquiry. So we know what we got right and we know what we got wrong, because one thing you can put your hat on, Jack, put the house on, is that we will have another pandemic one day.
Yeah. I tried to read Adam Crichton's column and got about halfway through and lost interest. But
oh, come on, mate. Yeah, I know. Look, he was really saying, I was for Sweden in 2020.
Yeah, I know.
And it turns out I was right all along,
Which is precisely why I lost interest. I don't think that's good.
Yeah, I know what you mean, yeah.
What I would say about lockdowns, and some of this I said at the time, was that I thought we were too fixated on one problem, COVID, instead of looking at the wider view of society and saying, well, look, we are going to suffer deaths from COVID.
Bad things are going to happen. It's a pandemic.
Yeah, that's right. The idea that you could turn back the tide, it just was nonsense. What we should have been looking at was not just the damage that COVID could cause, but the damage to other things and that the lockdown could cause as well. Things like people not coming back to school, things like kids not having a normal childhood where you could play on the swings and slides. And the curfew.
Well, that was just dumb. I mean, that was dumb at the time. It was dumb then. That's what I mean. It's not. I know there's a lot of revisionism and stuff, developed in hindsight. But that was dumb then,
At
closing
the
off
time.
switches.
Yeah, and we shouldn't get too carried away with revision in hindsight, because people were making these decisions very quickly, something that we talked about on here quite a bit.
Yeah.
One thing I would say that, what's her name, Parnell Palm McGuinness, Paddy McGuinness's daughter, put in the paper the other week that she thought the legal system and the lawyers had failed. And as a lawyer myself, I absolutely agree with that. We used to be the people, the progressive lawyers used to be the people who prided themselves on, we are the people who will stand between the citizen and the state when the state is acting excess to its authority. And we utterly failed. We did not give a yelp. We did not protect the citizen from the state at all.
Well, there were a number of people. There were a number of law firms. Some of them a little bit dubious, I got to tell you, Jack, that did undertake actions against vaccine mandates, against various impositions on freedoms of movement and so forth. And they got belted in the courts.
Yeah, where were the Council for Civil Liberties? Where were the courts? Where was the Australian Human Rights Commission? They all went missing.
Can I just run because this one is just one of your fixations, not mine, Jack. Well, it is probably a little bit of mine now too. But we went through the death rates and the excess death rates and causes of death, and we mentioned diabetes at 19% high death to diabetes. Another hike in dementia, including Alzheimer's, at 11.7%. Respiratory disease, a jump of just 6%, 5.7%. And cancers, Jack, down. Now, I would strongly suggest that we need to have a bit longer time to look at the data before we draw any conclusions. I would suggest with that too, because
there is a lead time with all this.
There is a fair amount of lead time with all of that. It's just very interesting. Stroke, by the way, is down. Stroke was down by 9%. Very interesting. Cardiovascular disease, relatively stable. So, yeah, interesting stuff. Some of the idiots who think this is a cause of the vaccine, need to have a proper look at the stats if they're able to do so. And certainly our parliamentarians should be a little bit more gentle about what they do about this sort of stuff. Yeah, so there you go. I think the lesson.
I look forward to the column.
The lesson from all of this is don't do apples versus narwhals. And if you're that thin-skinned about getting things, what you thought was right 2 years ago, now you find by some cherry picking of data that you want to prove yourself right again, I'll be around to let you know. All right, so
I'm just pleased if I was right last week.
Look, I got a fair bit wrong about that. Look, the other thing that I haven't mentioned about this is that Sweden, with its commendable low excess death rates, has a higher rate of boosters than we do, Jack. While we've got higher rates of booster shots.
Yeah.
So they've got 66%, just under 66% on 3 shots or more, and we're at 54%.
I think they just about shut down the vaccine program here in Hong Kong.
Well, this is part of the problem. The people are saying, we had that idiot, what's his name, the host of the Channel 9 show, morning show, Stefanovic, saying, I'm not getting any more boosters. I'm not going to do any more. And people in high-risk situations, either by age or by pre-existing health condition, might be being influenced by that, and I just don't think that's right. And that may well be a trend that leads to at least some of the cause of our excess deaths. Anyway, over to sport. Happier times, Jack, because the Blues, weren't they fantastic on Thursday night, knocking off the reigning premiers, humble them with an 8-point win. Was a very good performance. I love the way they just steadied in the last 3 or 4 minutes, where they've been a bit shaky in the past, Jack, with sides coming back at them. Who did we have on the Friday night? We had the blackout, Jack. Did you see that?
I did.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the lights went out. The power went out across the ground, so we couldn't hear anything. There was an eerie silence from Brian Taylor that I found quite enjoyable.
Yeah, well, I was watching it in the boozer with some mates, and we don't have the sound up, which is a much better. I recommend it as a way to watch the AFL. Turn the sound down, just watch it.
Yeah, well, they were off, I think, to the best part of an hour, and they did resume the game. I think the Lions were about 40 points in front when the delay
managed to fall over the line in the end.
And then Melbourne came home with a wet sail. But if the game had been going on, I think they might have got a bit more of a percentage boost, the Lions. They're 1-1. Who has started well? Collingwood. They surprised me. But they look very good. They've beaten Geelong, and they made light work of Port Adelaide last week. Gave them a nice old belting. Who else has started well in your eyes, Jack?
The Saints have started all right.
Yeah. Speaking of punditry, they were my tip to win the wooden spoon. So perhaps don't listen to me too much on AFL, but
I did see a nice bit on the social media. An ex one of yours and an ex Collingwood player, the only bloke who played 100 games with both clubs, Daisy Thomas, was on there, and he's being interviewed about his. He goes on this thing. He went on this thing called the Carlton Draft, where country and suburban clubs can put in a request to have a former player come and play with them, right? And he got assigned to go to Neil, who hadn't won a game in 1,000 days. And they hung on to get the win, and he spent the last quarter drifting across half-back, picking up the easy kicks. And Nathan Buckley's comment at the time was, that's the dream of every retired player, to be the loose man in defence, when the wind's coming your way in a very dry way.
So you'd still be you'd look still pretty fit, Daisy.
Yeah. Nathan Buckley signed up this year to go on the Carlton Draft scheme. So,
you can hear the hamstrings twanging now.
Yeah, they were asking Daisy Thomas about that. He says, a few of us have been talking about. Heath Shaw was on the phone, and we're talking about getting the Rat Pack together. Alan Didak and the Brownlow medalist, Swanee, and myself.
Swanee's had a game recently, yeah.
Yeah, and he says, and we'll play for the other mob. Which just goes to show that all of those years at Collingwood, there were factions within the group.
Yeah, well, they won a flag that era. But look, the other mob has started really well, Jack, and this pleases me because it was my father's team, North Melbourne. They've had 2 wins. They've been wooden spooners or thereabouts for a long time. And started out well with 2 good wins. Beat the Eagles first
they've
time.
Already equalled their tally from last year.
They do look. I don't know if you've seen them play. They've got a very good midfield, and they've got a few weapons around the place, and their defence is not the worst.
I'm not sure they're going to go all that far, but they're okay, and they're certainly better.
They're certainly better. Yeah. Look, let's see. I mean, who did they beat on the weekend?
They beat Freo.
Not a bad effort. Fremantle aren't a bad side.
They beat Freo in Freo. That's
Freo. That's right. Yeah,
it's not too bad. So they're much, much better. The best thing I saw on social media in the football was after the Collingwood game at the weekend was on Twitter. Peter Dacos may become the 3rd best Dacos footballer ever.
Gee, that's early days. Early days for that.
I thought that was quite good.
One of them's having a little bit of a spell with injury too, I think, at the moment.
Yeah.
That was enforced last weekend. Tigers looked pretty good to me too. They had a draw with Carlton first up, and then gave Adelaide a nice old touch-up. Adelaide came back, as you'd expect, in front of their home crowd, but the Tigers hung on. They've got plenty of weapons. They've got the 2 new midfielders from the Giants, and that's allowed them a lot of options like Dusty going forward, although I think he'll miss a game or 2 with an injury, possibly a hammy. NRL, Jack, what are the Queenslanders going to call it? Are they going to call it a derby or a derby, or what are they going to call it when the Dolphins play the Broncos?
Well, it was a full house. It looked to me. I saw that on the telly. And a cracking game. It's you look at that and you say, why didn't the NRL do this about 20 years ago?
Probably should have done it quite a few years ago. Broncos came out with the first win of whatever they're going to call it, Derby-wise. And very interesting round of NRL, Jack. It was a bit, just a handful of points between every game. And no beltings at all. So it looks like a very even sort of season. Even Melbourne Storm only won by a couple of tries at home against the Tigers, who were winless. And we'll just give our Premier League coverage, which we don't do very often, Jack, but can Arsenal now relax a little bit? And I was talking to a mad Gunners fan last night. He's toey as hell. I think they've 10 more games. They're 8 points in front of Man City. And, I said, mate, just got to start relaxing now. They had a couple of big wins in the last week. The Premier League just now goes into a bit of a layoff while they play the European Cup. But they look like they might get the goods. And at the very bottom end of it, Jack, the other thing to watch is Wrexham AFC, heavily supported under new management with Ryan Reynolds and his mate, throwing a lot of money and energy at the club. And they look like, they're about 3 points up at the top of their particular table, with the chance of them being promoted into the next comp next year. I don't know if you've seen the Wrexham AFC documentary, but it is a wonderful thing. A wonderful thing that Ryan Reynolds and his mate
I'll have a look at that. My lad's a huge Spurs fan, and once again, Spurs just sacked their manager.
they just keep missing out on Europe. That's their first thing. Arsenal, well, look, Man City have come from the clouds. Did it last year. Everyone's sort of expecting them to do it now. They do play each other at the Gunners' home ground in a couple of weeks or 3 or 4 weeks' time, and that probably be the one.
What's it called? The Emirates Stadium or something?
Emirates, yes. Thank you. I was trying to think, but this is it is a very fine stadium for soccer. Now, take us out, Jack. Prince Andrew, much benighted member of the royal family. He's going to do a bit of writing.
He's had a look at Prince Harry's example and with the success of his book Spare, and he's considering knocking out a book of his own because he was a spare before Harry was a spare.
Look, hasn't he always had the best advice available to him, Prince Andrew? Any scandal that comes along, he's been able to have these clever people make it go away.
This could be the greatest literary act of self-harm. I thought Harry's was pretty good, but Prince Andrew's is going to top that, I think.
I think at least Harry's book sold. Sell very well.
Oh no, Andrew's book would sell. We'd all buy it just for the laugh, you know.
I think I go as far as reading an extract.
Yeah, he has a spectacular lack of judgment. He's the bloke who walked out of the Emily Matlas interview, that car crash interview, and said to his staff, "I thought that went rather well."
yeah. It was called a car crash. Someone called it a train crash, and I wrote about it and called it. It wasn't just a train crash; it was a train crash into an orphanage before coming coming to rest on a box of kittens. It was an absolute disaster. We can expect nothing else.
He told his mother, the late Queen, that he thought it went rather well.
Yeah, I think that went well. I don't sweat. I was at a pizza place. There's no witnesses to.
She may have agreed at the time, and in a few days she had taken away all his privileges, so she came to a different conclusion. But yes, I'll be looking forward to that. I just like to see people do themselves harm,
particularly at that level.
And just before we finish, the Vice President of the United States has hopped on the Air Force 2,
Right.
and gone across to pester the Africans. She's
Where's she
making
gone first? She's gone to South Africa. They won't have the power on.
I think she's in Ghana first.
Right.
And the first speech she made was, there are a number of things on the issue of the economy as a whole that we must do. And a lot of that work is the work that I'm here to do on the continent.
There you go.
As you have mentioned, we have had this afternoon, a wide-ranging discussion. We have discussed a number of important topics, including the importance of concepts and priorities such as freedom and liberty.
There you go. What's wrong with that?
And
Aim small, Jack. That's what you've got to do.
As one wag said, she's like the kid in about the 14-year-old kid who's reading a book report out loud in class on a book she hasn't read.
Well, I think with that bon mot, we'll leave it there, Jack. Thank you very much for your time today and your thoughts on all matters global and in Australian politics and society as well. And we just want to remind our listeners that if you want to hit us up, ask us some questions, make some comments, make some criticisms, death threats if you like, you can hit me up on my Twitter DMs. They're always open. And Jack, give it to your Substack is Hong Kong Jack, I believe.
HongKongJack.substack.com.
Substack, and that's how you get on.
You leave all sorts of nasty
stuff on there. If you want to abuse the tripe out of him, go and do that. Yeah. All right, thank you, Jack. Thank you for your time, and thank you, listeners. And we'll be back next week with another show. Thank you.
Cheers.